The Christmas season had cast a magical glow over the town, and Mark's parents' house was no exception. The driveway was covered with a light dusting of snow, twinkling like diamonds in the bright winter sun. The festive atmosphere was suddenly punctuated by the arrival of a sleek black limousine. It purred to a stop, and out stepped Mr. Brandreth, resplendent in a white suit, complete with matching accessories. He was followed by a distinguished middle-aged man and his elegant wife. The front door opened and Wayne Davidson stepped out, a broad smile spreading across his face. "Merry Christmas, please come in," Wayne greeted. Mr. Brandreth smiled. "Merry Christmas, sir. May I introduce you to my brother and my sister-in-law?" Teresa and Mark appeared in the doorway, greeting their guests warmly. "Good to see you, young man. Joe, Dolores, this here is Mark, the most brilliant boy I've ever met, and here are his parents, Wayne and Teresa Davidson." The group gathered, engaging in lively conversation. "I've got some good news. My brother Joe has agreed to stay and help me run the businesses." He shot a knowing look at Mark. "It's become so successful I can hardly manage it myself. I need all the help I can get." "You certainly have been busy. You've hardly had the time to come visit us in some time." "Well, I'll be sure to help out however I can," Joe said. "But I'm happy for my brother. He's really shot up there in the last few months. A far cry from when I last saw him. Call it a Christmas miracle of sorts." "Oh, that reminds me," Mr. Brandreth interjected. "With all the success that has befallen me as of late, I thought I would extend my good fortune to your family as well. Mark, how about you and your parents take a quick look outside?" Mark and his parents peered out the window. Mark's eyes widened in amazement as he saw a brand new Porsche sports car gleaming in the driveway. Next to it, a pristine SUV awaited his parents. Mark's face split into a wide grin, and he ran to give Mr. Brandreth a big hug. "Thanks, Mr. Brandreth," Mr. Brandreth winked. "No thank you, Mark." Wayne and Teresa exchanged stunned glances, words failing them as they tried to process the incredible gifts they had just received. Mr. Brandreth walked over to Wayne, clasping his shoulder. "Merry Christmas!" Later that day, the spirit of giving continued as Mr. Brandreth visited Kim's parents' house. They shared a joyous reunion, and he revealed another set of surprises: a brand new white Corvette for Kim and a new SUV for her parents. The family's joy was palpable, their smiles wide and bright. That evening, Mr. Brandreth stayed for dinner, the warmth of the Christmas spirit radiating through the room. The new year dawned bright and full of promise as Mark and Kim found themselves dining with Mr. Brandreth in his expansive new home. They sat around a massive dining table, the room filled with warmth and the delicious aroma of the meal they were about to share. Mr. Brandreth raised his glass, his eyes twinkling with pride and gratitude. "Well, my friends, we have accomplished so very much in such a short time. Thanks to you, Brandreth Corporation owns vending machines, arcades, car washes, and laundromats across America. I never could have done it without you." Mark and Kim exchanged a knowing smile, their hearts swelling with the sense of shared achievement. "We're a team," Mark said. "We all helped in our own unique ways." Mr. Brandreth shook his head slightly, a soft smile playing on his lips. "It is you two that did all the real work, Mark. But I am glad I could be of service towards such a wonderful endeavor. Say, why don't we take a much-deserved vacation? We could invite your parents and my family to Hawaii for a few weeks." Kim's eyes lit up with excitement. "And maybe France?" "Why not?" Mr. Brandreth laughed, clearly enjoying their enthusiasm. Mark's face broke into a broad grin. "That would be amazing." A short while later, the entire group found themselves on a pristine beach in Hawaii. The sun was bright, the waves were inviting, and the air was filled with the sounds of laughter and joy. Mark and Kim were riding the waves, their faces lit up with pure exhilaration. Nearby, Mr. Brandreth relaxed under the shade of a palm tree, accompanied by Mark and Kim's parents and his brother and sister-in-law. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Mark and Kim sat atop a hill, gazing down at the gentle waves. The scene was idyllic, the perfect ending to a perfect day. They shared a tender kiss as a few sailboats glided by in the distance. Their Hawaiian adventure continued with dining at the finest restaurants, where Mr. Brandreth would often raise his glass in a toast. To success, to friendship, and to many more adventures together, he would declare, his pride and joy evident. A few months later, the group found themselves in France, a land of romance and rich history. They indulged in more fine dining and explored the many attractions Paris had to offer. They attended a grand ball, visited the iconic Eiffel Tower, and took endless photos to capture every precious moment. All too soon, their whirlwind trip came to an end and they returned to Atlanta. A sleek limousine was waiting for them at the airport, a fitting end to their luxurious escapades. As they settled into the plush seats, they couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. Mr. Brandreth turned to Mark and Kim, a contented smile on his face. "This is just the beginning, my friends. Here's to many more successes and unforgettable moments." Mark and Kim nodded, their hearts full of gratitude and excitement for the future. Nothing could possibly take their dream away from them. This was it. They'd made it. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office in Washington, D.C., Detective Frank Harper of the FBI, a man in his early 40s with a seasoned look, sat behind his cluttered desk. The phone on his desk rang and he answered it without looking up from his paperwork. "Detective Harper," he said briskly. His secretary's voice crackled through the receiver. "Detective Harper, Burnside from the U.S. Treasury Department is on line 2 waiting for you." "Thank you," Harper replied, pressing the button to switch lines. "Joel, how are you doing?" "Fine, Frank, absolutely fine," came Burnside's voice, slightly strained. "But I'm calling because we have a little problem in Atlanta as of late." Harper leaned back in his chair, sensing the gravity in Burnside's tone. "All right, shoot, what's going on?" "It's big. Nothing official yet, but it could be very big." Harper furrowed his brow. "Okay, what is it?" "There's a good chance some illegal drug money is starting to pour into Atlanta." "Well, Atlanta has been growing. That I've definitely seen, but I don't think that's a bad thing, do you? What makes you think it's illegal?" Burnside's voice lowered, as if wary of being overheard. "It's been growing far too fast in the last 2 years, Harper, far too fast. We believe the Brandreth Corporation is involved in money laundering. See, this Mr. Brandreth went from literally a useless old retiree to having a multi-million-dollar corporation in under 2 years. Unless he has some extremely wealthy family, which is not the case, I smell something extremely fishy with this one." Harper's interest was piqued. "Well, it's certainly interesting. What about you guys? Are they getting involved?" "Not yet," Burnside replied. "Like I said, there isn't enough to go on for now. But I want you to do some investigating and see what you find. Put a few hot coals under Brandreth's feet and see which way he jumps." Harper nodded, already forming a plan in his mind. "All right, I'll check it out and keep you informed." "Thanks, Frank. Good luck." Harper hung up the phone and stood, grabbing his coat from the back of his chair. He knew this would be a delicate operation requiring both subtlety and thoroughness. As he walked out of his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that this investigation could lead to something much bigger than he anticipated. He stepped out into the cool evening air, determination set in his eyes. Detective Frank Harper walked into the grand lobby of the Brandreth Corporation, taking in the opulence of the place. It was a stark contrast to the modest government offices he was used to. He scanned the room and spotted Mr. Brandreth in deep conversation with another businessman. As Harper approached, Mr. Brandreth noticed him and ended his conversation. "Hello, sir, can I help you?" Mr. Brandreth greeted him warmly. Harper spoke up. "As a matter of fact, yes. May I speak to Mr. Brandreth?" Mr. Brandreth's demeanor shifted slightly, but he maintained his cheerful composure. "Here I am. How may I help you?" Harper flashed his badge. "Detective Harper, FBI. Would you mind if I ask you a few questions?" Mr. Brandreth looked a bit concerned but remained accommodating. "Of course. Step into my office." They entered a massive office adorned with expensive furniture and watercolor paintings. Harper couldn't help but be impressed. "You have a very nice office, Mr. Brandreth. It's nearly as big as my house," Harper commented as they sat down. "Well, thank you. I very much enjoy the finer things in my old age," Mr. Brandreth replied with a smile. Harper got straight to the point. "Mr. Brandreth, the reason I'm here is it has come to the Bureau's attention that your corporation seems to be buying up a lot of things. Seemingly every business that's for sale comes into your ownership one way or another, some almost immediately." "Why, yes, isn't it wonderful to be a free capitalist?" Mr. Brandreth said with a chuckle. Detective Harper stared into Mr. Brandreth's eyes, his investigative instincts on high alert. "Mr. Brandreth, I'm going to get straight to the point. Where exactly are you getting your massive financial backing from?" Mr. Brandreth leaned back in his chair, maintaining his calm demeanor. "Well, to be honest with you, I have had numerous offers for backing, but I've refused them. I prefer to build a business organically from the ground up. The right way, the American way. Just as the founding fathers intended. Also, growing at a stable rate is better for my health and stress. I've unfortunately had a few heart problems to contend with recently." "I'm sorry to hear that," Harper said sincerely before returning to his main line of questioning. "So, you basically got started on your own, Mr. Brandreth?" "Well, yes, with the help and encouragement of a few very good friends." Harper's curiosity was piqued. And who might those be? Well, I would rather not mention them at this time. They ask that their privacy be respected, Mr. Brandreth replied smoothly. Harper sighed, feeling the frustration build. Mr. Brandreth, it's your partner's involvement that I'm here to talk to you about. Now you seem like a very nice man, Mr. Brandreth, and I'll have you know that we're conducting an investigation into whether or not your corporation is involved with illegal drug money. Mr. Brandreth started to chuckle, much to Harper's offense. What's so funny? This is a serious matter, Mr. Brandreth. Detective, sir, this corporation was built from a small business. It's not my fault that I happened to roll the dice on the game of life and get lucky. Besides, even if I was doing what you're claiming, nobody would ever be interested in laundering change, now would they? Harper was taken aback. Change? That's our primary revenue source after all. Vending machines, car washes, laundromats, arcades, none of it is of any such concern, sir. Harper was extremely baffled. Let's go back a little. Your partners. How did this get started? Mr. Brandreth leaned forward, his tone becoming more serious. Well, one invested $4,000 he had saved up from cutting lawns and other things, and I invested the same from my savings. The other helped keep our records and stocked the machines when we first started. Harper sat back, trying to connect the dots. The story seemed almost too simple, too mundane to be true, yet something didn't add up. He needed to dig deeper, but for now he had more questions than answers. Detective Frank Harper exited the Brandreth Corporation building and crossed the street to his car. Settling into the driver's seat, he pulled out his laptop and began researching various arcades and laundromats owned by the corporation. As he scrolled through the search results, he kept an eye on the entrance of the building. Soon he saw Mark and Kim step out and walk towards a sleek black Porsche parked nearby. Harper watched as they got into the car and drove off, the engine purring smoothly as they disappeared around the corner. With a determined look, he started his car and headed towards one of the Brandreth Corporation's arcades. He parked a short distance away from the arcade and observed from his car. After a while, an armored Brinks truck pulled up in front of the building. A guard stepped out and entered the arcade, reappearing minutes later with several bags in hand. Intrigued, Harper started his car and followed the truck at a discreet distance. The truck made its way to a laundromat, parking outside. Moments later, Mark's Porsche pulled up alongside it. Mark and Kim got out, each carrying a few bags. They handed the bags to the guard and then walked inside the laundromat. Harper's curiosity grew as he continued to tail the security truck. The truck's final stop was a bank. As the guard began unloading the money, Harper parked his car and followed him inside. He approached the bank manager, flashing his badge. "Detective Harper, FBI, I need to see where the security guard is taking those bags," he said. The manager, wide-eyed and cooperative, nodded. "Of course, detective, right this way." Harper was led to the back where the security guard was unloading the bags. With a nod from the manager, Harper opened one of the bags and stared in shock at the contents, rolls upon rolls of quarters. He opened another bag and found the same thing. Some of the quarters were neatly rolled while others were loose, spilling into mounds. Baffled, he turned to leave when the guard accidentally dropped one of the bags. Quarters scattered across the floor. Harper bent down to help pick them up and noticed something odd. Each quarter had the same year stamped on it. He inspected a few more, his eyes widening with realization. Every quarter was identical in year of production and impossibility. Harper stood up, his mind racing. Detective Frank Harper returned to his vantage point outside the Brandreth Corporation building the next day, determined to gather more evidence. He watched as Mark exited the building, got into his sleek Porsche, and drove off. Harper followed him discreetly, tailing him all the way to a storage center on the outskirts of town. Not long after, Kim arrived in her white Corvette. Harper waited until both of them were inside before he made his move. Later that day, Harper returned to the storage center and rented a storage unit of his own, giving him a legitimate reason to be there more often. That night, he parked his car discreetly and observed as Mark and Kim drove into the storage facility. They headed to their unit, disappearing behind a wall of soda cans and containers. Harper watched as they spent hours inside, counting and rolling quarters. Eventually, they emerged, carrying several bags filled with their ill-gotten gains. Kim pocketed the last 7 loose quarters. "I'll take these. I may need some change for later," she said, slipping them into her purse. As they shut the unit door, a single quarter slipped from one of the bags and fell to the ground. They loaded the bags into Mark's Porsche, shared a brief romantic moment, and kissed before driving away. Once they were gone, Harper approached the storage unit, searching the ground meticulously. His eyes caught the glint of a shiny quarter. Picking it up, he saw it bore the same year as the others. This confirmed his suspicions. Something was definitely amiss. He needed to get to the bottom of this mystery. Returning to his car, Harper retrieved a pair of bolt cutters. With a decisive snap, he broke the lock on the storage unit and carefully opened the door. As he groped around in the darkness for the light switch, he accidentally knocked over the massive wall of soda cans. They toppled over, causing him to stumble and fall. Regaining his footing, he finally found the switch and flicked it on. The fluorescent lights buzzed to life, illuminating the cluttered interior. In the center of the room were two chairs, evidence of Mark and Kim's long hours spent rolling quarters. In the corner, Harper noticed a shoebox filled with paper quarter rolls. He approached it, his mind racing with possibilities. This was no ordinary operation. The sheer volume of quarters, coupled with the identical years of production, pointed to a sophisticated counterfeiting scheme. Harper stared at the shoebox, deep in thought. This discovery was significant, but he needed more to bring down the entire operation. His next steps had to be calculated and precise. With renewed determination, he knew he had to gather enough evidence to expose the full extent of the Brandrift Corporation's criminal activities. Later that day, Mr. Brandrift sat behind his imposing desk, deep in conversation with Mark. Their discussion was interrupted by a call from his secretary. "Mr. Brandrift, sorry to bother you, but Detective Harper is here to see you again," the secretary informed. "All right, send him in. Oh, and it's almost 5 p.m. If you'd like, you can leave a little early today. I'll lock up when I leave." "Thank you, sir," she replied. Mr. Brandrift hung up the phone just as Detective Harper walked in. "Detective, hope you're having a pleasant afternoon. This is Mark." "We were just having a little chat," Mr. Brandrift said warmly. Harper gave Mark a stern look, making him visibly nervous. The detective took a deep breath before addressing them sternly. "I know what is going on here and you're both in a lot of trouble. But before I bring in the cavalry, I want to give you both a chance to cooperate," Harper declared. Mr. Brandrift looked confused and slightly offended. "I don't have the foggiest idea what you're talking about, detective." Harper pulled out the quarter he had previously found and placed it on the desk. Mark's face turned pale as he realized they had been discovered. Harper took note of his reaction. "The quarters, Mr. Brandrift, the illegal counterfeiting of millions upon millions of them by you, Mark, Kim, his father, and whoever else is involved. Your whole company, perhaps." Mr. Brandrift was horrified. "You can't be serious!" "I am, Mr. Brandrift. I've done a lot of checking over the last few weeks, including your recent transactions and quarter collecting. Tell me, Mr. Brandrift, did you know that the United States only stamps a limited number of quarters per year?" Harper began pacing around the room as Mr. Brandrift and Mark listened, both horrified and nervous. "And how do you suppose that in the last 2 years or so, over half of those quarters made happen to wind up being spent in your businesses?" Mark looked in horror at his blunder. Mr. Brandrift tried to retort, as Mark struggled to control his shock. "Well, it's not my place or yours to tell the public how to spend their money, Mr. Harper." "No, it isn't, Mr. Brandrift. You had quite an operation going, it seems, stamping the quarters at Macklin Token Plant, opening businesses to filter them through that primarily used change as payment. A brilliant scheme, I must admit." Detective Harper examined the counterfeit quarter, turning it over in his hand with an air of grim fascination. "Very impressive," he remarked, his voice steady and authoritative. Mr. Brandrift's face turned red with anger. "You're crazy!" Harper didn't flinch. "I'm afraid you and your friends are looking at a lot of time. Now, why don't you come clean and tell the truth?" "The only one who's not telling the truth is you, Harper. You come into my office with this crazy made-up story?" Mr. Brandrift's voice trembled with a mix of rage and fear. Ignoring him, Harper turned to Mark and locked eyes with him. "What about you, son? You realize you may be spending the rest of your life in prison?" Mr. Brandrift stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Mr. Harper, I'm not going to sit and listen to your nonsense anymore. You may leave now." Harper's expression remained unchanged. "Very well, I'll be back in due time with warrants for everyone involved, and I do mean everyone. In the meantime, consider what I said. Your cooperation will be beneficial for yourselves in the long run." "Get out!" Mr. Brandrift roared, his voice echoing in the office. Harper headed towards the door but paused for a final remark. "I wouldn't plan on leaving town anytime soon, Mr. Brandrift." As the door shut behind Harper, the tension in the room was palpable. Both Mr. Brandrift and Mark were visibly shaken. "The gall of that man! I ought to file a suit against him for harassment." Mr. Brandrift fumed, reaching for his phone to call his lawyer. Mark hesitated, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if we should do that, Mr. Brandriff." Mr. Brandriff froze, phone in hand. "What are you talking about? Those are serious charges he is falsely accusing us of." Mark lowered his head, his hands trembling as they covered his face. Seeing this, Mr. Brandriff slowly lowered the phone, suspicion dawning on his features. "Mark? You wouldn't know anything he was talking about, do you?" Mark shuddered, struggling to find the words. Mr. Brandriff's voice grew more desperate. "Mark?" Finally, Mark looked up, his eyes filled with guilt and fear. I just wanted us to be rich, to never have to worry about money again. I didn't..." "Mark, no, don't tell me we..." Mr. Brandriff's voice cracked with devastation. Completely shaken, Mr. Brandriff slumped back into his chair, his gaze falling on an old picture of his wife and son. He slammed his fist on the desk, a wheezing sound escaping his lips as he clutched his chest. Mark rushed to his side, his own fear mounting. "Mr. Brandriff, are you okay?" Gasping for breath, Mr. Brandriff reached out to Mark, his voice faint. "Water! Water!" Mark hurriedly poured a glass of water, but when he returned, he found Mr. Brandriff collapsed on the floor. The glass slipped from his hands, shattering on the ground as he cried out in horror. "Mr. Brandriff, I've got to get an ambulance!" Mark fumbled for his phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands. As he did, he watched helplessly as the life faded from Mr. Brandriff's eyes. "Mr. Brandriff?" Mark shuddered, his voice weak. There was no response. Mr. Brandriff was dead. Mark started to cry. "Mr. Brandriff!" His cries echoed through the empty building as sirens rang out in the background. Mark and Kim stood solemnly over Mr. Brandriff's grave, their heads bowed in grief. Behind them, their families began to disperse, dabbing at their tear-streaked faces with tissues. The air was heavy with sorrow as Mark and Kim held hands, slowly trailing behind the departing mourners. That night, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring at the phone in his hand. He glanced at Kim, who gave him a supportive nod. Taking a deep breath, he dialed Joe, Mr. Brandriff's brother. "Hi, Joe. Kim and I need to talk to you, please. It's important." The scene shifted to Joe's house later that evening. Mark stood nervously before Joe and his wife, Dolores. He cast a glance at Kim, who returned his look with a solemn nod, encouraging him to speak. "Joe, there's something I need to tell you. There's no good way to say this," Mark began, his voice trembling. "Most of our business was built on counterfeiting quarters." Joe and Dolores stared at Mark and Kim, their faces masks of shock. "What?" they exclaimed in unison. Mark swallowed hard, pressing on with the confession. "You know how my dad supervises a token manufacturing plant? Well, me and Kim went in one night and thought we'd make a few quarters to buy a soda or two. Then we came up with the idea of stamping millions of quarters and having a business. Then we could deposit them and reinvest them without attracting suspicion." Joe and Dolores listened, their shock deepening with each word. "Your brother helped us start with a couple of soda machines. We never thought anyone would find out about it. But now this detective guy has. He knows about my dad's plant. He knows everything, I think. I just don't know what to do now." Kim squeezed Mark's hand as Joe shook his head, a look of deep concern etched on his face. The room fell silent as everyone grappled with the gravity of the situation. Joe finally broke the silence. "You've really gotten yourselves mixed up in something big here. All of us. What a mess." Mark looked at Joe, desperation in his eyes. "So what do we do?" Joe thought for a moment before speaking. "We've got to find a way to get this detective out of the way." Kim's eyes widened in horror. "You mean kill him?" Joe shook his head vehemently. "No! What are you talking about? Of course not. But I'm sure there's something we could do. You may not like it, but from what I can see, it's either this or we all end up in prison for a long time." The group spent the next few hours discussing their options, eventually formulating a plan. "Okay, so tomorrow?" Mark asked, seeking confirmation. Joe nodded. "Right. I'll go through and cash a check, buy some of the stuff we need, and set up another meeting for later on to get the rest of it. Dolores, you go into the bank and take care of the larger withdrawal. I'll meet you here to get it from you." Dolores nodded, her face resolute. "You've got it." Joe turned to Kim. "Kim, you check out the car he drives and get the tag number. I've got a friend in the department that I'll ask to run a check on it. Mark, you find a locksmith. Meet us here at 1 p.m. tomorrow. We go from there." The group nodded in agreement, and Mark and Kim headed outside. As they reached the car, Mark pulled Kim into a tight embrace and kissed her. "I hope this works," Kim whispered. "Me too," Mark replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For all of us."